All right, this is a recording for Biology 1407, Chapter 37 in the OpenStax textbook, the Endocrine System, the second chapter of Unit 3. So, all right, so let's go ahead and start. A hormone, as you can see right here, is a regulatory chemical. It is a signal molecule, of which there are many in the body, but the ones that are referred to as hormones have a couple of particular characteristics, and that is that they're carried in the bloodstream. If a signal molecule is not carried in the bloodstream, we don't normally refer to it as a hormone. It's a signal molecule. In fact, it may be the same signal molecule, but it's really a hormone only if it's carried in the blood. And because of that, hormones secreted in one portion of the body from even just a few cells in one small location can make contact with any other cell in the body, in theory, and influence their behavior. Key functions of hormones in the endocrine system is to regulate homeostatic values, or modify those homeostatic values, like the fight-flight response is heavily hormone regulated, to change the body to a new set of conditions for some period of time. Another major thing that hormones regulate is development and reproductive behavior. Right. You can watch this video. It's sort of a simple little introductory video that kind of gives a quick, very brief lesson on endocrinology and hormones. It's good as a little opener. It's not a good thorough review by any means. So the endocrine system just consists of all of those tissues. Sometimes it's just small bits of tissues in a larger organ like the brain, or entire dedicated organs like the thyroid organ. That release hormones that have effects on other parts of the body. So that collectively is the endocrine system. All right, we want to get a couple of ideas out of the way here that are variations on a theme. So endocrine communication involves a signal molecule being released into the interstitial medium. So this is the fluid, between and around all of the cells inside your body, with the exception of the external epithelial surfaces, but all, even those living cells in the epithelium have contact on their undersides, at least, with the intracellular, the interstitial fluid. And anything released into that interstitial fluid has an option, or a potential, based on diffusion, size of molecule, and things like that, to enter the circulatory system and therefore get distributed throughout the body and diffuse down its concentration gradient to all other parts of the body. And cells that are equipped to respond to the hormone, in that they have a receptor sensitive to that hormone, can be influenced. So that's what we mean by a hormone in the endocrine system. Some other versions, of the same idea are paracrine actions. So that's where one cell is influencing a nearby cell through the interstitial medium, but not through the circulatory medium. And then finally, there are cells, for instance, in your immune system, and a lot of other tissues in your body that, under certain conditions, release signal molecules that bind to receptors on the cell itself and influence the behavior of the cell. For instance, a cell that's infected by a virus, very topical thing right now, releases hormones, or signal molecules, I should say, that can influence nearby cells and cause them to cease replicating proteins, cease generating proteins, which is a way of stopping viral replication. Well, amongst the cells having receptors to that substance called interferon is the cell that sent the signal in the first place. So it can actually shut off its own protein synthesis using the same molecule it released, which would affect nearby cells in a paracrine function, and that's called autocrine function. So autocrine, paracrine, endocrine, three variations on a theme. Endocrine, the key idea here is that we use the circulatory system as a long-distance dispersal mechanism. All right, some other terminology. Glands. When we talk about glands in the body, we generally can distinguish between two types: exocrine glands and endocrine glands. So we'll get exocrine out of the way first. That's a gland that leads to a body surface, as we see here, via a duct, a tube, that directs those secretions to a surface somewhere. And that can be an external surface, as all three of these lead to, or an internal surface, like the digestive tract or the lungs. You have exocrine glands in the lungs that produce mucus, which is the mucus that you cough up. Well, that's released onto an epithelial surface. So endocrine glands are not connected to a surface. They are, in fact, epithelial cells that are isolated from a surface. It's just a bunch of cells collected together, but inevitably they're derived from epithelium. And the only connection they have to the rest of the body is via the circulatory system and, close by, the interstitial medium that all of those cells are embedded in. All right, so signaling molecules. So hormones are specifically signal molecules that are distributed by the blood. Some other examples that are not distributed by the blood, but that are signal molecules, are neurotransmitters, acetylcholine, and all of the other molecules that allow one neuron to communicate with another one, or one neuron to communicate with a muscle cell, are neurotransmitters. Neurohormones are secreted by neurons but affect particular tissues. So an example of that would be adrenaline is a neural hormone. It's released by the adrenal gland by neurons that lead directly to the adrenal gland, and then secreted into the bloodstream from there. So neurohormones kind of bridge the gap between the nervous system and the endocrine system. Pheromones are signal molecules that are distributed in the air, or in water for that matter, but in an external medium outside of the organism, and can influence target cells on another organism. So famously, all mammals, including humans, produce pheromones that influence reproductive behavior. Then hormones themselves are molecules that are released into the circulatory system and make contact with other parts of the body. And we have a range of these. Gases, as you can see right here, if you're not aware of it. Nitrous oxide is released by epithelial cells in the circulatory system, and it induces relaxation of smooth muscle in the circulatory system. So dilation of arterioles leading to capillaries, so that blood flow is increased to areas. Nitrous oxide tablets have traditionally been an emergency medication given to people with obstructions of coronary circulation, basically people that are in danger of having a heart attack. And the nitrous oxide tablets, you may have seen old films of somebody putting a tablet, having a heart attack and grabbing for a tablet and putting it under their tongue. It dissolves and releases nitrous oxide into the circulatory system and immediately dilates circulatory components, thus increasing blood flow to the muscle of the heart. So that's where that idea comes from. All right, fatty acids from triglycerides. Y'all all know about fatty acids. Well, some of those are the things that are referred to as prostaglandins. These are signal molecules that are released in a lot of different places, but a good example of that will be the inflammatory signal molecules, cytokines, that are released by damaged cells, by cells of your immune system in response to injury or illness. And those prostaglandins affect nearby cells, inducing them to produce whatever emergency products they produce, or to replicate in the case of fiber cells for wound repair, epithelial cells for closing up tears in the epithelium and things like that. There's a number of different functions. So prostaglandins are an example of that, and as a lipid, primarily a lipid molecule, they are membrane permeable. Steroids, these are molecules that function in the regulation of development and reproductive behavior. Estrogen, progesterone, testosterone are three good examples. All of these are signal molecules that are made from cholesterol. They're a modified cholesterol, and that's where the steroid, sterol, cholesterol, that's the link between those words right there. Amines, polypeptides. These are single or short strands of amino acids. Epinephrine is an example right here, a stimulatory hormone of the fight or flight system. Epinephrine has a number of different functions. It is a polypeptide, a short polypeptide chain. The longer ones, big polypeptides, like insulin right here, regulating blood sugar levels, one half of the regulatory system for that. As we look through here, what we want to consider is solubility, hydrophobic and hydrophilic molecules. If something is hydrophilic, it's water soluble, that's going to be a hormone that binds to a receptor on a cell surface, right? Hydrophilic molecules can't pass through the phospholipid bilayer unaided. So there's going to be a receptor on the surface of the cell for a water-soluble hormone, like a peptide or an amine. If it's hydrophobic, like the steroids and to a degree the fatty acids right here, oftentimes the receptor is within the cell, and the signal molecule can pass right through the cell membrane and then bind to an intracellular receptor inside the cell. Another thing that's important is the size of these molecules, of these signal molecules. A gas like nitrous oxide has a very, very rapid diffusion rate. It quickly spreads throughout tissues, making contact with distant parts of the body very, very rapidly. A large molecule like this big polypeptide right here is going to take a lot longer to diffuse through the tissues of the body. It will initiate a response more slowly, if you will. All right. So that's what we're getting at on this slide right here. When we take a look at any hormone, what I want you all to be able to do is answer questions about the size of the molecule and how rapidly or slowly it will be diffused, and how quickly we can expect a response in a target area between a small molecule and a large molecule. When we talk about water-based and lipid-based hormones, that's that question about where is the point of action, right? So typically water-based molecules, hormones are binding to a surface receptor, and typically their effect is cytoplasmic. They influence the behavior of existing proteins in the cytoplasm of the host of the target cell. As a rule, those effects are pretty rapid. They come on quickly and they last a short period of time. They go off pretty quickly. The lipid-based hormones, typically, neither of these is absolutely exclusive statements, but if you want to generalize, and that's what I want y'all to do right now, the lipid-based hormones typically have a target of a gene, or genes, plural, in the nucleus of their target cell. So they pass through the cell membrane, they bind to a receptor protein that takes them on into the nucleus, and there they bind and become one of the components regulating gene expression, either turning on genes or turning off genes. Estrogen and testosterone, when they start being released in large amounts at puberty, begin permeating cells and turning on genes to express features in those cells that were dormant up until that point. So there's a stimulatory effect right there. Typically, these are slow to initiate, but a small amount of that lipid-based hormone has a very, very long span of action. It's going to influence gene expression for a very long period of time. So slow to start, long to last. We have steroid-based medications that you might get an injection of some steroids, as an anti-inflammatory action. They take a while to take effect, but then they last a good long while. And because they're regulating gene expression, that's why they're also somewhat dangerous. They have to be used very carefully and sparingly because oftentimes they have an immediate target, genes that are releasing inflammatory signal, creating proteins that are involved in the inflammation response. Say you're trying to limit hay fever or allergies or things like that. But oftentimes they influence other genes as well that inhibit key functions of the cell over a long period of time, and you don't want to do that for too long. So typically kind of caution there. All right, a little bit about hormone variability. Here we've just got some models of them. So here's epinephrine right here, which is a modified amino acid. Notice the amine group right here, a central carbon. And melatonin, tryptophan, tyrosine, all relatively small, simple, modified amino acids, as compared to something like oxytocin right here, or growth hormone, follicle stimulating hormone right here, kind of related. These are terrifically huge molecules, so obviously they're going to take longer to reach their targets, and typically have a longer lasting effect due to the size of the molecule. It's not cleared so quickly from a target receptor. All right, lipid-based hormones, these guys here are all modified versions of cholesterol. So there's the cholesterol molecule, there's testosterone and estradiol, the root of estrogen and progesterone. Talked about this a little bit. So the nervous system again, neurons connected to other neurons and ultimately to muscle cells and a little bit of glandular tissue in a few specific locations. Very, very rapid responses, very, very specific, stops quickly, adapts quickly, expensive. The endocrine system through the bloodstream, widespread, slow, long-lasting, cheap. All right. So inevitably, the hormone to have an effect must have a receptor. A lot of poisons bind to receptors that normally some hormone is targeting. A lot of medications that we use bind to a receptor, mimicking the function of a hormone or blocking the function of a hormone, as the case may be. So the receptor is really the key right here. And if we can trigger that receptor, we can cause something to happen inside the cell, either stop some ongoing activity or start something that wasn't happening, when we trigger this receptor right here. And those receptors are expressed by cells, based on any number of different things. But yeah, there's very few receptors that are present on every cell in your body. Usually they're tissue specific or location specific or something of that nature. Some interesting aspects of endocrine function is if the signal molecule, say insulin, is extremely abundant, there's lots and lots of it in the blood, for whatever reason too much insulin is being produced, the target cells will downregulate their expression of receptors. So if they have fewer receptors, they become less sensitive to insulin. If there's too much insulin in the blood, they become desensitized. This is why a diet with lots of big spikes of processed sugars, where you get the so-called sugar rush or sugar high, that causes your pancreas to release very large doses of insulin into the blood. And what happens is the target tissues become desensitized to insulin because they downregulate. And so this leads to a form of diabetes, where the target cells have become non-responsive to insulin. And that's why diet therapy in that particular case can restore function. If you keep insulin levels very low by consuming very small amounts of sugar or very small amounts of dietary carbohydrates, the target cells will upregulate. They'll produce more receptors and become more sensitive to insulin, and you can restore the original homeostatic balance. It takes work, takes focus, but it can be done. So as I said before, but in a bit more detail, lipid-based hormones inevitably bind to transport proteins. As you know, lipids don't dissolve in water. So how do they go through the blood? Well, they're attached to a transport protein that carries them through the blood. Once they reach a cell membrane, they're released by that protein. They move straight across the membrane, and then they're picked up by a receptor protein in the cytoplasm of that cell. And that receptor protein transfers them to whatever their particular target is via diffusion processes or perhaps active transport. Just depends on the details. All right. So inevitably, the hormone has to bind to a protein, and the final protein that hormone binds to is its receptor, because that receptor then will complex with some other protein and alter transcription of a gene or what have you, leading to a change in protein synthesis in the target cell. All right, a little bit about transduction. So signal transduction is the process of taking information in one form and converting it to another form, right? Conversion of a signal from one form to another. So your touch, smell, sound, and sight receptors of your nervous system all take an environmental stimulus, light, vibrations in the air, something very related, pressure, on your skin, or chemicals in the air that bind to olfactory receptors in your nose or in liquid onto your tongue. All of those, that signal, that original signal, is converted into some chemical activity inside the cell. In the case of neurons, all of those sensors, ultimately into an action potential running down a neuron back towards your central nervous system. It's not smell that's literally coming into your brain. It's action potentials from cells in your nasal epithelium. It's not light that's going into your brain from your eyes. It's electrical impulses. Anyway, all of those are examples of signal transduction. So hormones do the same thing. The hormone binds to a receptor. The hormone itself does not go into the cell, so the signal doesn't go into the cell, in its original form. Instead, the receptor protein, its behavior is altered, so perhaps it doesn't interact with something initially. Now it does interact with that. In this case, this G protein coupled receptor right here. And we have this molecule interacting with yet another protein somewhere else, another enzyme, causing some cellular response. So that's an example of signal transduction here. We're looking at a water-soluble hormone, so its receptors on the cell membrane, and it induces a cytoplasmic response. Here's another example that brings a whole lot of these ideas together, but another example of signal transduction. This would be contraction of muscle tissue right here. These are actin and myosin filaments. What makes, this is the meat and potatoes of muscular contraction right here. This is the molecular basis for contraction. And that process is initiated by a neuron taking in an action potential reaches the end of the neuron. It causes vesicles of neurotransmitter to be released, a signal molecule. This would be a paracrine example right here, because this cell is real close to the cell, and this is interstitial fluid right here. And the signal molecule binds to a receptor right here. The receptor in this particular case allows a flood of sodium to come in. The flood of sodium coming in propagates across the cell and initiates the release of calcium inside the cell. This is the second messenger right here. And the calcium binds to receptors on proteins, particularly associated with the tropomyosin filaments right here. That allows muscle fibers, contractile fibers, to contract. So the signal at a chemical level was acetylcholine. It binds right here, but there's no acetylcholine involved in any of the rest of these steps leading to contraction. That's what we mean by transduction. Here's another illustration of a water-soluble hormone and its pathway. So in this particular case, this hormone binds to a G protein. G protein induces the phosphorylation of adenyl cyclase right here. ATP is stripped of two phosphate groups, creating cyclic adenosine monophosphate right here, which is a frequently used messenger molecule inside cells, especially for emergency processes to generate lots and lots of metabolic energy. Typically, if you've got a lot of AMP inside a cell, you're running out of energy. And so AMP is a signal molecule to do things to create, to liberate more metabolic energy. So in this particular case, the cyclic AMP is the second messenger. It binds to other proteins, which triggers other things to happen, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, until we finally get, protein activated to do something, which may be a protein that breaks apart glycogen and releases glucose into the cytoplasm. It could be any number of things. All right, and here, just as a visual reminder, a water-based hormone right here, attached, it's not shown, but this would be attached to a transport protein in the blood, and then it leaves its carrier protein in interstitial fluid right here. That protein makes contact with the cell membrane. The hormone itself crosses the membrane because it's lipophilic, it's hydrophobic. Then it binds to an internal receptor right here that leads to importation into the nucleus typically, and then this becomes a regulatory component of gene expression, whatever the particular gene. You get messenger RNA, new protein function, being produced. And this could be inhibitory. We could stop this process, keep a protein from being produced, or the signal could be stimulatory, and we could generate, the release of a protein, or both at the same time. One hormone may inhibit some genes from being expressed and stimulate other genes from being expressed. Very similarly, a water-based hormone right here may have multiple receptors on the same cell, or different types of receptors on different cells, so that the same hormone causes different effects, 2 or more effects on a given cell, one inhibitory, one stimulatory, both stimulatory, it just depends, or contrary effects in different tissues in different locations. For instance, epinephrine causes vasoconstriction in circulatory tissue of the digestive system, less blood flow to the stomach, basically, or the intestines. But the same hormone or signal molecule causes vasodilation in smooth muscle of circulatory components of the lungs and heart and skeletal muscle. So you get more blood flow to those organs. And epinephrine is a component of adrenaline, part of the fight or flight response. And so what we're doing there is modifying the body so that there's increased blood flow to organs involved in fighting or running away, and decreased blood flow to all other organs not necessary for that purpose. You don't need to be digesting, you don't need to be generating urine, you don't need to be synthesizing reproductive cells at that moment. So blood flow to those organs is all cut down. An example of multiple effects from a single molecule. And it all depends on the receptors and what the receptors are bound to. Here's an example again of a membrane-bound hormone receptor and a signal transduction pathway right here. Typically on these pathways, one single receptor activates a whole bunch, in this case adenyl cyclase right here, converts a whole lot of ATP to cyclic AMP. It converts a whole lot of this, so then we have a huge amount of cyclic AMP being distributed all through the cell right here. That's called an amplification cascade. It's very typical of hormonal signals. And so ultimately a whole bunch of the target proteins are affected by just one receptor binding to one copy of the signal molecule can initiate many, many copies of the same response throughout the cell. All right. Now we'll just run through a couple of the, or a few of the processes that are regulated by the endocrine system, partially or completely. It just depends on the details. So for instance, an example in the excretory system, which is your kidneys, the rest is plumbing, your tubes leading to the bladder, the tube leading from the bladder to the outside of the body. But the key organ is the kidney, of course. And we have a hormone called antidiuretic hormone right here, ADH, right? So it is distributed through the circulatory system, and it has an effect on the kidneys themselves by regulating the uptake of water from urine. So if there's a lot of antidiuretic hormone being released into the blood, and that's typically released when blood pressure goes down, we will retain more water from our urine and produce very, very concentrated urine. Thus, we're keeping water back in the body, and that water can contribute to raising blood pressure. Low amounts of antidiuretic hormone, diuresis, is the process of filtering blood. Diuresis is filtering water out of blood. So antidiuretic hormone stops that or reduces that filtering. Underproduction of antidiuretic hormone causes a lot of water loss through the urine, copious urine production, and that's one of the symptoms of diabetes mellitus right here. Diabetes insipidus right here, as opposed to diabetes mellitus, which has to do with the insulin receptors. All right, another one for the excretory system is aldosterone right here. This is produced by the outer layer of the adrenal glands over the kidneys, the adrenal cortex. That's the outer surface of the adrenal glands. And its target is, there's a component all the way through the body, but it's released due to signaling from the renin-angiotensin system right here, which is a blood pressure regulating system. Anyway, aldosterone induces increased water retention again in the kidneys. It contributes and amplifies the effect of antidiuretic hormone. And it is, high doses of aldosterone, you retain a whole lot of salts, pull lots of salt back into the body. And if you pull a whole lot of salt back into your blood from the urine that you're producing in your kidneys, you'll pull water back in via osmosis. So it promotes the reabsorption of water by promoting the reabsorption of sodium. Okay, reproductive system. Two hormones that are critical in the reproductive cycle in both males and females are follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. So follicle-stimulating hormone, FSH right here, stimulates maturation. Cells that are produced via meiosis mature into viable sperm cells with a functioning flagellum and all of that good stuff. So that maturation of those cells is triggered because they have receptors sensitive to this hormone right here. In females, similarly, it causes eggs to develop from immature oocytes to mature oocytes in the ovaries of the female. Luteinizing hormone stimulates the production of testosterone. So that hormone is produced in the gonads because of the dose of luteinizing hormone coming from somewhere else that we'll see in a bit. And in females, a big release of luteinizing hormone, a spike of luteinizing hormone when estrogen levels reach a certain level, is the trigger for ovulation specifically. And then here, we've seen this one before, oxytocin is a hormone that stimulates smooth muscle contraction, not all over the body, only on smooth muscle that has those receptors, which is smooth muscle of the uterus and also smooth muscle of the mammary glands in the breasts. And so both of those, the smooth muscle in both of those structures is sensitive to oxytocin. All right. We've talked about insulin and glucagon, so make sure that you know this. These are two hormones that are released by the pancreatic islets, oftentimes, or they used to also be called the islets of Langerhans. Those are little clusters of cells in what's otherwise a digestive exocrine gland, but those are endocrine tissues within the pancreas that are involved in blood pressure regulation. The beta cells in those islets produces insulin. When they detect high levels of sugar in the blood, they release insulin. Insulin causes other cells to take up sugar and pack it away as glycogen. Glucagon is the antagonist, which means it works against or opposite to insulin. It's released by another pile of cells called alpha cells in the same pancreatic islets. And if blood sugar levels are low, that's the trigger for these guys to release glucagon. And that causes the liver primarily, but to a lesser degree skeletal muscle, to break down glycogen and release it back into the blood. All right. We've gone over this a couple of times, so this is a look at the negative feedback loops grouped together that regulate blood glucose levels between too high, which is dangerous for osmotic reasons, and too low, because too low is dangerous because neurons can starve for ATP and actually die, and therefore you die. And we want to keep that at a sort of a balance between too high and too low. All right. Looking at the thyroid, an example of hormones produced by the thyroid, T4 and T3 right here. Two different molecules that are differentiated by the number of iodine atoms that are attached to them. And if you may be familiar with the relationship between iodine and the thyroid. If you don't have enough iodine in your diet, you can't make triiodothyronine. You can't make this hormone right here properly. You make the raw material for it, but you can't secrete it because you have to have iodine attached to it for it to actually be secreted and to have an effect somewhere. And then what happens is tissues that stimulate the production, stimulate the thyroid, induce it to make even more of these molecules that are incomplete. They pile up, and the thyroid gland actually swells and swells and swells as it accumulates unreleasable hormones because of the lack of iodine. And that's an example of upregulation due to absence of a hormone in the blood supply. Okay, and here are some examples of effects due to low levels of thyroid hormone and high levels of thyroid hormone. Right, another function of the, they're called the parathyroid glands. They're a part of the larger thyroid organ, but they're a separate tissue with a separate function. They produce parathyroid hormone and then calcitonin, produced by the main part of the thyroid gland, are two things that regulate calcium levels in the blood. We don't want to have really low calcium levels, because if they're too low, first we have problems with bone and tooth formation, but if they're really low, we have problems with neuron and muscle cell function, which can be quite deadly and quite quickly. So parathyroid hormone stimulates the stripping of calcium from bone, or the absorption of calcium in the diet. It upregulates that process, so you get more calcium into the blood. Calcitonin pushes calcium levels back down, because too high a calcium level in the blood tends to lead to crystals forming, and those crystals can be particularly damaging in the kidneys. That's one of the types of kidney stones that can be generated. We don't want that sort of thing happening, because that, in extreme cases, can be deadly as well. All right, having a little trouble controlling my, there we go. Okay. Growth hormone. Lots of cells in the body are sensitive to growth hormone, but in the presence of other hormones like testosterone and estrogen, a whole lot of cells stop becoming sensitive to growth hormone. So typically prepubescent, which is to say people that have not reached sexual maturity, cells, and particularly the bones of their limbs, are extremely sensitive to growth hormone, and that causes those receptors to induce that cartilage at the end of the bones to grow very rapidly, thus elongating those bones. There's a similar but not quite as dramatic response in skeletal muscle, and so this is what's responsible for the rapid growth, of an individual then. Well, when we release a lot of estrogen and or testosterone into the blood as, sexual maturity, that causes those cells to stop producing the receptors that are sensitive to growth hormone, and so we stop growing. And then in due course, the release of growth hormone is inhibited as well by those other hormones. So there's an interesting feedback loop right there. Growth hormone, like a lot of other hormones, is ultimately regulated by the hypothalamus in the brain via the pituitary gland. And we'll take a look at that in just a second. All right. Two examples of hormones involved in stress accommodation to stress. Short-term stress, a momentarily very dangerous situation, so-called good stress. We release a bunch of epinephrine. This causes time dilation. Time seems to go by slower for you. Heart rate and breathing all go up. Muscle tone increases. All your muscles get tenser. A bunch of things change, and that basically prepares you to run away or to fight. To fight or to run away. And also the freeze response is part of this right here. You're encountering an incredibly dangerous situation, and you actually have three things you do. You either run, you freeze, you either fight, you freeze, or you run away. And the freeze will resolve into one or the other of these two after a moment. Now, long-term stress, bad stress, continuously stressful situations tend to cause the release of cortisol from the adrenal gland right here. That is an anti-inflammatory. Unfortunately, that also means it depresses your immune system. Long-term stress depresses your immune system. Taking lots of anti-inflammatory substances depresses your immune system. An immune response is inflammation. This is part of your immune response to wounds and damage. But long-term stress triggers, long-term inflammatory responses, and we have a hormone that counteracts that. But the downside is it makes us more vulnerable to infection. So being under stress, that's why doctors say, to avoid getting the flu and now coronavirus, for instance, a good tactic is to get lots of exercise, get lots of rest, eat well, plenty of sleep and all that stuff to keep your long-term stress at bay. All right, we're just about finished here. We're going to go over the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland right now. So we're looking at a close-up of a cross-section of the brain. This is called the diencephalon, this region of the brain right here. That's not important right here. But highlighted in blue is the hypothalamus, and highlighted in green and in purpley orange right here is the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary, which are slightly different. They're significantly different. In A and P and things like that, we study these in great detail. All right, so the pituitary gland, anterior and posterior pituitary. The anterior is really its own endocrine gland. It really receives hormones via circulation from the hypothalamus of the brain, and then in turn it releases hormones based on the signals it gets from the hypothalamus that causes the pituitary to release its hormones, right, that affect other glands in other parts of the body, particularly the ovaries and testes, the thyroid via growth hormone, or thyroid hormone under the effects of growth hormone, releases a number of different hormones. The posterior pituitary is actually an extension of the brain, an extension of the hypothalamus, and it's the source of antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. Both of those are produced in the hypothalamus, collected in the posterior pituitary, and released by it into blood. So here's a look at the posterior pituitary right here, and notice we have neurons in the base of the brain. This is the hypothalamus right at the bottom of the brain, right behind the optic lobe, not the optic lobes, but the junction of the optic nerves coming from the eyes. They join into the brain right there. And these neurons right here secrete stuff into the posterior pituitary, where circulation picks up those hormones and takes them out to all tissues of the body, antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. The anterior pituitary, on the other hand, is a gland itself that responds to hormones released by the hypothalamus into the blood here, and that these capillaries lead directly to the anterior pituitary, and those hormones leak out of these, out of circulation into these tissues, induce the glandular, and they are a modified epithelial cell, the epithelial cells of the anterior pituitary, to produce their trophic hormones that are released into the blood supply, affecting tissues throughout the body. So here are the hormones produced by that anterior pituitary gland. As it says right here, at least 7 essential hormones. There's other more rare ones produced, but these are the ones most students are required to know. Adrenocorticotropic hormone stimulates the adrenal gland, the outer part of the adrenal gland, to make its hormones, including cortisol, the outer part of the adrenal gland. ACTH, adrenal corticotropic hormone. Melanin stimulating hormone induces the pineal gland to produce melanin in time with signals coming from the retina, so that we establish our day-night rhythm. Those are peptide hormones, relatively small, short, amino acid chains. The protein hormones, large hormones made out of a whole lot of amino acids chained together. Growth hormone and prolactin, which stimulates the mammary glands to produce milk. Oxytocin coming from the posterior pituitary gland, oxytocin right here, stimulates milk to be ejected by muscular contraction. That's the release of milk. But prolactin right here stimulates the production of milk itself, a different hormone. All right. The glycoproteins, which means it's a sugar-protein combination. Thyroid stimulating hormone stimulates the thyroid to produce thyroid hormone, T4 and T3. Luteinizing hormone, that's the one that gets the ovaries and the testes to producing to induce the ovary to ovulate, and induces the testes to produce testosterone. Follicle stimulating hormone, FSH, stimulates the ovaries and testes to produce mature eggs, to produce mature sperm cells. So those are the big ones right there. And again, posterior pituitary antidiuretic hormone, which antidiuresis means not filtering water out of the blood, so retaining that water, decrease of urine production. Famously, alcohol blocks the function of antidiuretic hormone. So if you drink some alcohol, you drink a beer or something like that, typically people have to urinate fairly copiously because alcohol blocks ADH function. Oxytocin, again, responsible for smooth muscle contraction in the uterus and in the mammary glands. Only late in pregnancy, only after you've had a protracted period of some other hormones present that induces those cells to produce the receptors that make them sensitive to oxytocin. So it's an interesting combination of effects. The adrenal glands are actual locations. These are the kidneys. The adrenal glands are these masses up above the kidneys right here. The inner portion is where we produce epinephrine and norepinephrine, stimulated directly by the brain. And in the cortical region, we have mineral corticoids involved in regulation of salts, glucocorticoids involved in some of the regulation of blood sugar levels, and then follicular corticoids that contribute and support the function of the main reproductive hormones. All right, and so here we're looking at the renin-angiotensin system, aldosterone, and ADH, and how they all contribute to blood pressure regulation. So the idea here is that if blood pressure is too low, we have a molecule circulating in our blood all the time called angiotensin, which means contract, heart contraction. So it, it induces more vigorous contractions of the heart muscle, all right? Increase in blood pressure via increased contraction of muscle tissue in the circulatory system. So when renin is present, angiotensin is converted into angiotensin 1 and 2, well, triggered, ultimately into being converted into angiotensin 2. This occurs in the lungs, interestingly enough. And angiotensin 2 stimulates the release of aldosterone from the adrenal cortex and antidiuretic hormone from the posterior pituitary. And aldosterone causes the nephrons to reabsorb more sodium, which causes water to be pulled back in via osmosis. Antidiuretic hormone actually causes the nephrons of the kidneys to produce pores, aquaporins, and produce a whole bunch of those, so that this effect is amplified because water is allowed to move down its concentration gradient more effectively through all these water pores. An aquaporin is a protein pore in a cell membrane that's specific to water molecules, and so it allows osmosis to occur more rapidly. If you have a lot of aquaporins, water will move down its concentration gradient, wherever that is, more quickly. Well, if we're pulling a lot of salt out of urine and back into the blood, which is what aldosterone does, then this water will move back into the blood more quickly. At the same time, antidiuretic hormone itself stimulates contraction of arteries, which increases blood pressure. All right, that is the end of this recorded lecture. I'm posting this in YouTube as well as in the shared files in Google Docs. Please watch this and come to class with questions. Thank you very much.